Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. Isa Blumi is here with us today to talk about the Red Sea region. This is a fully independent podcast. Lend your support at patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. And please like, share, and subscribe on the YouTube channel. We discussed the recent lifting of sanctions in Sudan, the development of the strategic Red Sea region, and the historical trends, the wars, economic collapse, exploitation, the violence, and the political engineering that led up to it as part of a much larger strategy and ambitions. In a bonus question, we discussed the likelihood that the 2020 elections cleared the way for multinational factions to resume imperial enterprises and transformations, and the way that politics, the media, and pandemic are employed. Dr. Isa Blumi is an historian, an author, and a professor of global history, the Islamic World, the Ottoman Empire, Yemen, and Albania. His very prescient book titled Destroying Yemen, What Chaos in Arabia Tells Us About the World, tells the story of the wars in Yemen, but also, quote, ultimately tells an even larger story of today's political economy of global capitalism, development, and the war on terror as disparate actors intersect in Arabia, unquote. We recorded this on November 12th, 2020. Isa Blumi is here, returning to the show, and it's always great to talk to you, Isa. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
It's a great pleasure to talk to you again, Joanne, and show your listeners.
So today we're going to talk about a topic that Isa, a long time ago, has talked about the strategic value of the Red Sea area and sort of warned us, keep an eye on that because it's going to become more and more important and it's going to provide sort of an explanation for things that are going on. So a recent incident is that just a week before the election, the Trump administration announced that there would be a normalization of relations between Sudan and Israel, and that they were on the United States list of state sponsors of terrorism, which is one of the harshest kind of sanctions that there can be, that we can wage against any country. And that's been, I think, almost 30 years they've been on that list for a number of different reasons. But now he is trying to lift those sanctions. It's still going to take some doing with Congress. And that, I think, still hasn't happened yet. But it is framed as part of these normalization deals, these peace deals between Israel and various states in Middle East and North Africa. But we think that there's a bigger picture there. The country is also under a transitional government. It seems like a shaky deal. The country's in really dire straits, food and fuel shortages, and they really need assistance. They need some foreign investment. They need humanitarian aid. But they overthrew their long-time leader. I think he was in for at least 20 years. And they have a transitional government so that it is, questionable whether they are even authorized to do this. I heard an interview recently about it, and I contacted Isa to ask for his insights on this, both on Sudan and the bigger picture, which he always provides so much clarity for. And Isa, you should know that listeners are constantly asking for you to come back on another interview. So we're really hoping that you can give us some insight on this. And then we're going to do a bonus question at the end with sort of prospects, get Isa's thoughts on the election in the United States and the prospects for a Biden war and foreign policy. But we'll do that in a bonus question at the end. So let's start with Sudan and the Red Sea region, if you would.
Right. Well, a very astute observation on your part, and to actually initiate a conversation about this is very much appreciated. The Red Sea, for better or worse, has long been a target of let's say, an arena for control, for obvious reasons, perhaps, since the 1869 completion of the Suez Canal, which connected and expedited trade between Europe and Asia by at least 2 to 3 weeks. Indeed, the British Empire would not have survived very long if it could not have maintained assurances that its fleet would flow through the Suez Canal freely. And they even went to the extent of actually occupying Egypt in 1882 to assure that just that. And subsequently, the investment in controlling the other entry point into the Red Sea, the Bab el-Mandab, which involves the Yemen, the Horn of Africa, areas that have only seen conflict for the last 30, 40 years, and largely because of this strategic value of the Red Sea, but also not only in the relationship between Europe and Asia that it's maintained, which can now be circumvented with these super tankers, which actually don't fit in the Suez Canal, and can sail fairly quickly around Africa, or pipelines even. So what other things could be contributing to the Red Sea, and why there's seemingly a new interest in securing both shorelines? Well, one is clearly the enduring possibility of finding offshore oil wealth. There's largely unexplored blocks of geological space that awaits the proper kind of investment in developing the oil and gas resources. I've mentioned in the past, certainly was highlighting this in my book, that there was at a time when the Arabian Peninsula was experiencing a boom in construction and was seeing visions of another century of continued growth, that there would be demand for access to water and also food security. And what actually the proximity of the southern part of the Red Sea offered to the Arabian Peninsula was an actual feasible bridge that was first proposed by the Bin Laden group and was indeed receiving already considerable funding, exploratory funding, to build a bridge that would link Djibouti with Yemen and thereby connect the Arabian Peninsula and, more importantly, those countries to the north, especially Saudi Arabia, which the idea would be that they would, through rail and roads and build super cities on both sides of this bridge, create and recreate a whole universe that would be self-sufficient in food, the water that would come from Ethiopia as it dams the Blue Nile, which still remains a contentious issue today for especially Sudan and Egypt, which is very much part of this whole question about Sudan and the war on terrorism, which you initiated this session today about. So I'll get to that in a second. Just indeed, again, remind your listeners that up until, let's say, 2015, 16, 17, when financing became basically impossible to foresee, to follow through on these projects, the Horn of Africa and Southern Arabia were being set up for being integrated into a regional economy that was in the process of being transformed, with huge, huge possibilities of profits for development of infrastructure, especially along the Red Sea coastline of Saudi Arabia. They had what they called a 2030 vision, where they were going to build a series of cities that would model themselves after Dubai. The idea was that money from the outside would come flowing in, and investment from around the world would come and subsidize the construction of these sites that would both cater to this idea that Saudi Arabia is on this perpetual trajectory of permanent growth, and to assure that to become well integrated into the economies of the Horn of Africa, but more importantly still, winking kind of quietly in the dark, forging a financial and development alliance with Egyptians and therefore Israelis. The far northern part of the Red Sea, which has already seen considerable growth in tourism on the Egyptian side, was also going to be now promoted with Jordan, Israel, and Saudi Arabia joining in, creating this kind of free zone where there would be casinos, there would be all the kind of sordid kind of business that comes with gambling, the consumption of alcohol, and these kind of free zones that would be considered offshore assets in the legal context of Saudi Arabia. So all this needed, of course, some kind of uniformity of practice, some kind of stability for the insurance companies and the financiers in the outside world to actually throw their money at these projects, and ultimately some kind of collateral, which required some kinds of reforms in Saudi Arabia, which we've seen with this this Suleiman. But of course, there was the big attempt at securing the assets of the southern entry point of the Red Sea, especially on the Yemeni side, and that proved to be a disaster, which is an ongoing one and something that Saudi Arabia in particular cannot pull itself out of. In the meantime, we've had this continuing problem for Omar al-Bashir's government in Sudan, which had been ruling Sudan since 1989, I believe, and was only overthrown with most likely a lot of intelligence assistance from Israel and elsewhere in 2019. The subsequent interim government has been making overtures and been given these promises that if they reconcile their relationship with Israel, that they could possibly see a lifting of this rather brutal instrument of American influence on events in that part of the world. Why is this important? There's the hope that they would actually cultivate a working relationship with those who are in power now, who should be an interim government. It should not be one that has any ambitions of staying in power much beyond any kind of elections that were ideally going to be held at some point. But it seems that this is one way of consolidating the power of this junta that's now in control, again, claiming to be there only temporarily. But the key assets here are, one, to deal with this water conflict with Ethiopia, to deal with the problem that South Sudan, which had been successfully peeled off from larger Sudan in what was a long enduring war of seeking independence, also turned out to be incredibly well endowed with oil. The problem for Southern Sudan is that not only is there internecine violence that continues to make it impossible to actually exploit the oil resources, much of its infrastructure that had been invested and built during the time when it was still part of larger Sudan remains in what is northern Sudan, the would say majority Muslim Sudan territory, which is the area that we're talking about now with lifting the sanctions. There's all kinds of investment. Political careers in the United States have been largely predicated on what happened with this process in 2011, where finally South Sudan secured independence in a very corrupt process. It is tied in very much with the larger lake districts further south, Rwanda, Burundi, East Congo, Uganda. There was, in theory, going to be a pipeline that would take South Sudan's oil wealth southwards out to the Indian Ocean via Kenya, but that has proved to be much more difficult than anticipated. And so what remains this kind of big prize of huge amounts of oil resources that just sitting there and suffering from the consequences of having a bad relations with Sudan in the north. So my suspicion is that we're looking at a time that there's a hope to somehow resolve that issue where they can actually start to bring some of that oil out of Sudan, out of South Sudan via Sudan, which there is the infrastructure that exists. There's the pipelines was built, the refinery in Port Sudan, which is on the Red Sea, is there. It's just that this was never made possible because of the kind of dynamics on the ground, which to a large extent, a woman named Susan Rice was very much part of. Someone who is being named as the possible Secretary of State for this new, if Biden becomes president, Biden administration. Susan Rice, who was a very young woman during the time of these bloody wars in Rwanda and South Sudan, was made her career on the death and destruction of that part of Africa, and lots of blood on her hands. And the kind of people that have emerged out of the United States, let's say, political economy of war and the neocon kind of universe that has been created since the Bush administration and the Clinton administrations have never left the CIA, the kind of inner, to say the middle tiers of the State Department or the Department of Defense. And I think they have very much their hands in this. The idea that this is Trump's policy to somehow rehabilitate Sudan seems a bit problematic, considering the very difficult relationship Trump has had with government agencies throughout his administration, where there was a clear divide in the Department of Defense and the FBI, in the CIA. He did not necessarily have these agencies working entirely under his, let's say, command. And it's no doubt that there was lots of kind of planning to get rid of Ahmed al-Bashir in 2019, and then finally find a way to somehow create new facts on the ground in Sudan, which includes integrating Southern Sudan's oil. Recall that there was this terrible, long-standing war in Western Sudan, which even brought Hollywood celebrities to the fore, right? Darfur conflict, which had its dirty links also with the same neocons and the oil industries that were linked to Chad. It's just a horrible, horrible, complex story that has not been ever explored in these ways. And I think the Red Sea is the important conduit for all of this wealth that's sitting there untapped, unrealized. It is also very important we should think about China here. China has been very effective in securing the eastern coast of Africa. This is not by surprise that when Mozambique and Kenya and Tanzania have forged and become somewhat financially dependent on China, that it has also resulted in shutting out opportunities of exploiting Central Africa and areas like Sudan for the Americans and the North Atlantic world. That's something that's also been somewhat forgotten. And the fact that Ahmed Bashir had good relations with China and was able to maintain that there's some kind of self-sufficiency despite this embargo over the last 30 years is now somewhat been reversed with the coup, with his removal, and now this push towards rehabilitation via, publicly at least, having a relationship with Israel. This would, of course, allow for the Israeli finance, Israeli companies to get directly involved legally in this process. This most likely has connections to the now revitalization of these plans to develop, at least partially, Saudi Arabia's Red Sea coast. Now, in all of this, we've just now seen an outbreak of war between Tigrayan territories of Ethiopia and the central government of Ethiopia.
Yeah, that's in the headlines today.
Is it really? Uh-huh.
Yeah, they're saying that thousands, tens of thousands of refugees are fleeing Ethiopia into Sudan, causing them They're already in crisis, and now more crisis because of the flow of refugees.
This is a little triangle between Eritrea, Sudan, and Ethiopia that I have actually been doing quite a bit of research recently about. There's important water channels that actually are very important for the continued agricultural sustainability for Sudan in that area around Kassala. There's for Eritrea, which has had fought many border wars since independence in '93 with Ethiopia. It's pitting in interesting ways the leader of Ethiopia, who is Ali Ahmed from the Omoro region, which is the far eastern areas bordering Somalia, which you have seen an uptick in violence over the last 5 to 10 years, which also has a lot to do with exploiting the resources of these regions without the presence of any really formal sovereign state. There's all kinds of nasty things that are interconnected with the whole story about Yemen, which I've been talking to you and your audience about before. This is just a continuation of that does not seem to end in terms of suffering for the peoples who sadly live in very rich part of the world culturally. It's rich culturally because these are areas that have been thriving for thousands of years, agriculturally speaking, in terms of trade. It just so happens they also sit on top of lots of water, which is highly valued commodity. It'll be even more so in the next 10 years as this global reset takes its next phase and next form. Food politics is certainly a part of all this. The idea that Ethiopia shuts Sudan and Egypt off of an important percentage of annual flow in the Nile is certainly a source of conflict which Egypt has threatened to go to war with Ethiopia about. Sudan was on Egypt's side until right now, which is now an interesting added dynamic to the coup, and indeed what's happening with reconciliation with Israel and maybe the Americans lifting its embargo on Sudan. So that's a mouthful. That's the way to start the conversation, John. Good luck with that.
Yeah, I appreciate that a lot. Sudan was just, a place on the map for me. For the most part, I don't know a lot about the continent of Africa, that I'm learning more. But I do remember that it is when Wesley Clark infamously revealed the long-term, well, they were really sort of medium-term goals of which countries we wanted to take control of. Sudan was in that list, Sudan and Somalia, along with Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Sudan, Somalia, and Iran was sort of going to be the last one on the list, which I assume means harder, but Sudan was, part of that. The other thing I didn't realize until, I started looking at the maps, Sudan, it looks like on their eastern coast, there's one big city called Port Sudan, and it's actually very close to Jeddah. The Red Sea isn't that wide. From eyeballing it, it looked to be at some parts like only 100 miles across, and in other parts, well, it's diagonal from Port Sudan to Jeddah, and it would only be maybe 200 miles. So these places are close. So let's say if someone like Saudi Arabia really needed a lot of water and other things, more oil resources, so I didn't realize quite how feasible that was. And then Sudan, the greater Sudan, has all the coastline, not a giant coastline. Eritrea has a lot of coastline for the size of the country, but just the geographics there are so obvious when you just look into it even a little bit. And then Sudan also has a lot of the Nile River, right? So because it goes down, up through Sudan, and there's like a big loop, so there's more. You can see where the roads are being built. Some of them parallel the Nile. Maybe they're sort of paving old routes or something like that. But you could see the if you look at where the highways are, because there aren't that many, you can see the trade developing there. you could see, and that Port Sudan is just a really key place. And then, of course, there's always the One Belt, One Road initiative, New Silk Road, some people call it. And we know that the Suez Canal is, one of the most, this whole Red Sea area is supposedly going to be one of its most important regions, one of its most important areas. And while it wasn't talked about a lot here, the One Belt, One Road initiative by China, it is getting a lot more, it's becoming a lot more obvious that it's becoming like a top issue in the defense industry here, and the people who decide who our threats are and this and that. Yeah, it's not surprising. It's always really kind of gut-wrenching to see how these countries are messed with when it's really maybe it's a proxy war for influence, like you mentioned, the former, I don't know if he was a dictator or a leader, whatever, he was aligning with China, presumably to help with development. As you said, it always plays out the same way. The crackdown with the sanctions, put the boot on a particular country. They've got nowhere else to go for trade, for creating a stable area where they can get investments. And then in the past decade or so, China becomes the alternative place to help. You could look at it as like to help you out, but China is has business objectives too. So I don't really know how much control issues are for them in terms of ideology, or whether it's all about business. So it's just they look like proxy wars to me, and Sudan's got a lot to offer to protect. All that green area on the map that starts in the lower part of Sudan, and that triangle that you talk about with Eritrea. So the Trump move looked to be sort of a political move. I just wanted to mention too that in this article that I just read, this is done a week before the election. Anything done near an election always has a political aspect to it. But also they talked about a phone call that Trump had with Netanyahu. And supposedly he said, "Do you think Sleepy Joe could have made this deal, Bibi?" as he talked to Benjamin Netanyahu over a speakerphone. So I guess this is another leak about things that happened. I don't know whether that really happened. Half the time, those kinds of leaks are dubious. But it looks like he was he was worried about who Netanyahu was going to support in this election. And of course, after the election, it became clear that Netanyahu is, not so supportive of Trump. I don't think he endorsed. After the election, he came out and he said, I'll support whichever president, whoever becomes president, which should be surprising given the way that Trump, over his period of time in office, bent over backwards to give Israel almost everything they could possibly get.
Yeah. Yeah.
But there were rumors that they had had a falling out. There were rumors that he also had a falling out with, I guess, Sheldon Adelson is his main connection to Israel. From as much as we know, we don't know that much about the inner workings. So it looks like it was a political move. But what you're saying, that the neoconservative coalition that came into power, and talk about Wesley Clark again, he called it a foreign policy coup. That these used to be the extremists that, really could never gain that much influence, though they constantly tried for decades. They've been inside the bureaucracy, but they couldn't really gain that much traction. And then boom, under the Bush administration, they were in a key place in the bureaucracy, and somehow they gained just massive amount of influence and began to steer the war policy and foreign policy. So the whole issue about how that faction, that extremist, they were certainly They were the hardliners. Let's put it, that's the best euphemism for it. Once they got, even though the Bush administration just completely collapsed in terms of support from the country, they stayed in the bureaucracy. They stayed in power. Who their other backers are in the corporate world or the defense world, not exactly clear, but certainly they're there. Now they have aligned with the Biden team. And as best we can see, Team Biden is not exactly a continuation of the Obama administration, though there was always a neoconservative faction inside the Obama administration, as you mentioned, Susan Rice. But there's a clear alliance between the establishment Republicans, if you will, the establishment Democrats, which includes the neoconservative faction with people like Bill Kristol, have been very open about this, very, very open about it. So, the Trump administration was never able to, I'll give him that, never able to fully implement the kind of policies that he talked about and that he seemed to want. Of course, he always had that tie with Israel, who is aligned with the neoconservatives. So it was always doubtful how much he really did oppose the neoconservatives, or whether it was just sort of an impossible position he was in. But if we have Biden coming in with this coalition of, it seems like, to me, it looks like the worst of the worst. I don't see how this going forward, how this is, from my perspective, good for us, or certainly not for these countries in Africa.
That is certainly the case. And of course, people on the ground in these regions have a very difficult time assessing what is actually going on, and how to read the kind of overtures that they're maybe receiving. But I think most of those who are not just willing to sell out their own populations and sell out all principles and just, get into bed with, quite literally, the Likud party and the neocons, which is basically the offer, like a gangsters in New York City. It's an offer that they basically can't afford to refuse at this stage, because we've seen what has happened to other parts of the region that have resisted this. And this, again, was largely under the stewardship of the Obama administration, whereas Syria, Libya, Yemen, a number of other places in the region have received the brunt of the, let's say, disciplinary power of this enterprise that I say links in various complicated ways Qatar, Turkey, Israel, this larger universe which often intersects with Takfiri Islam, Islamic terrorism, that is used at certain points of time to destabilize societies. Then we have this whole other element of, let's say, media, which we've seen come to play even in our United States, in the United States political context, where really media has been utilized to mobilize large numbers of people to do things that are counterproductive to realizing long-term, let's say, reconciliation or long-term stability in the society. And it's playing itself out in the United States in many ways, as I was observing 2010, 2011 in West Asia and in the Balkans in the mid to early 1990s. It's a very scary thing to watch from afar, what's happening in the United States. And one of the consequences is that people are not able to think, I don't think, they're not able to think clearly anymore. So you have this weird embrace from a wide range of people who one would think ideologically, theoretically would have been completely disgusted at the idea of jumping into bed with the likes of these neocons. I mean, but they seem to have been completely rehabilitated in the media and therefore embraced as a team to go after the orange man, which is a very sad kind of reductive kind of public politics, which is now going to have huge consequences on the United States and unfortunately the region that we're talking about today. Because this is an area that obviously has some strategic value. There's an investment in destroying Sudan for a long time now. I don't know if your listeners understand that Sudan was actually part of Egypt until 1955. That just before the rise of the, let's say, Abdel Nasser and the whole crisis over the Aswan Dam, the financing of the Aswan Dam, and then the Suez War, the British had successfully peeled off this vast territory that had once been that had linked the Mediterranean all the way down to Uganda, thanks to the efforts of Muhammad Ali from the beginning of the 19th century. And this remarkable, vast country that had so much potential to becoming, a major player in the world had to be destroyed, and it successfully was destroyed. And unfortunately, the population who live in these areas have been consistently facing insurgencies, civil war, starvation, and as we see now, a new level of kind of, I would say, even more sophisticated kind of political engineering that's taking place that we have no idea what's going to have kind of consequences, but it's already translating in violence in Ethiopia, Eritrea. It's an extension of the violence that we're seeing in northern Mozambique, which now we're seeing the rise of an Islamic separatist group. It extends across to Chad and to northern Nigeria, and obviously since the last 20, 30 years in Congo, Rwanda, etc. This is all interconnected, actually.
That's one heck of an ambitious goal, though. I mean, this is huge amounts of territory.
Which, again, are much more easily exploitable if there's actually no sovereign state, if there's no uniformly administered entity. This is what since the quest for independence for these countries, they've constantly tried to adopt this neo-colonial kind of pressure on these societies. I mean, the whole war in Congo in 1960 to get rid of Lumumba, right? They were carving out in Katanga these artificial states with the hope of those resource-rich areas to be ruled by some little puppet dictatorship, and they can exploit those resources. Well, as I've suggested now, you don't even need states. You just have chaos, and you can extract those resources at a much cheaper rate with this semi-slave labor and these supply chains that are often even built by Chinese at free of cost for the global markets that are interested in these raw materials.
It's hard to understand whether China and the West are at odds here or whether there's some degree of cooperation.
I think the Chinese people themselves are under horrible pressure, and they're incredibly abused by their political leadership, who sometimes are having difficulties within the inner circles of the Communist Party, and you've seen some heads roll, often with kind of public condemnations of failed local administrators, things like that. But it seems that power has really been consolidated in all hands of this inner circle around the current leader of China, and has subsequently been very influential in pushing for this Trans-Pacific Trade Alliance, has made some strong inroads with certain actors in American power circles. Who knows if how much we're going to investigate the kind of relationship that the old Obama administration had developed with, especially through Biden and his son, which I think was a story for about a day in the United States.
Yeah, and they just completely suppressed it like I've never seen before in my life.
Yeah. And we have to remember that China and the United States, these people around Kissinger, which, Susan Rice is the kind of grandchild, the intellectual grandchild of Kissinger and the power circle that he developed and cultivated that crossed political party lines, right? And he's celebrated by these, let's say, center-right, center-left types who are basically working for corporations. They work for Wall Street. And they have captured both parties to the extent that, the working class doesn't know if they have any champion in American politics anymore. And you certainly see that with the response that people, working class, have given to this guy who was, he certainly wasn't royalty in New York. He was a guy who rough and tumbled his way through property development, became this kind of used car salesman who became, casino owners. I'm talking about Donald Trump, of course. And he tapped into this frustration in American public in politics. But that doesn't translate in changing the power dynamics. That's clear. I mean, this guy has been since day one anathema, right? And he's been toxic for mainstream media and for the power in both parties. And that translates into this interim period that we're now going to see the last part of it in the Red Sea, in the Arabian Peninsula, in South China Sea, throughout Africa, and sadly enough, even inside the United States itself. We are seeing a big transition with COVID playing an unspoken, perhaps, or still unconsidered role in all this. But that's something that maybe we should talk about some other day. I don't know. It seems very much distant from Red Sea, but it is interconnected, I would suggest.
Right. It's probably a good time to switch over to the bonus question, which we've already touched on a little bit. But I'd just like to hear your thoughts a little bit more on this election, the significance of it, and it looks like Biden will be installed, whether he legitimately won the election or not. At the moment, that's what it looks like. And what you think, just maybe go into a little bit more about what you expect from this Biden coalition, I'll call it, and what their war and foreign policy priorities will be, and kind of how you think it might play out. The answer to the bonus question is in a bonus segment for patrons. Subscribers at Patreon get access to bonus segments that come with most episodes, other material, and access to our Discord channel, where we can discuss things among ourselves, and hopefully we'll expand that into some Q&A live streams, input from listeners, and such. So that's my tease, and I hope that some of you will join us. And now I'll continue with the interview wrap-up. All right, well, thank you so much again. I hope to talk with you again soon, and I wish you all the best for you and your family.
Thank you, and you and your family too, please. Only the best, and hopefully you can have your Thanksgiving.
Yeah, hope we figure something out. All right, talk to you later then. Thanks for listening. Special thanks to Isa Blumi. Follow Isa on Twitter at Isa Blumi. Find his work at Google Scholar and his latest book at UC Press. This podcast is independent media, so listener support is important. Patreon.com/AroundTheEmpire, PayPal.me/AroundTheEmpirePod. Find the podcast on any mobile podcast app, on the website, AroundTheEmpire.com, on Patreon, or on YouTube. And if you're listening on YouTube, don't forget to like, share, subscribe. Follow on Twitter at AroundTheEmpire, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everybody.